Werner Henke stood on the conning tower of U-976, watching the horizon blur between steel-gray water and heavy cloud, when the hydrophone operator's voice crackled through the intercom with words that would shatter everything he believed about survival at sea. In 18 seconds, the entire doctrine that had kept German submariners alive would prove to be a deadly illusion, and the men under his command would learn that the ocean's embrace offered no sanctuary from what was coming. The Bay of Biscay rolled beneath the submarine's hull in long, restless swells that spoke of Atlantic storms gathering strength far to the west. It was March 25, 1944, and Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke had been at war for nearly 5 years. His face bore the weathered stamps of countless patrols, the pale complexion of a man who lived in artificial light, breathing recycled air thick with diesel fumes and human sweat. At 41, he was older than most U-boat commanders, a veteran of the merchant raids that had once terrorized Allied convoys. Now, in the 5th year of war, he commanded U-976 through waters that had transformed from hunting grounds into killing fields. The submarine cut through the waves at a steady 8 knots, her diesel engines rumbling a familiar cadence that vibrated through the deck plates. Henke pulled his leather jacket tighter against the wind. Spring in the Bay of Biscay meant unpredictable weather, which was both blessing and curse. The cloud cover overhead hung at perhaps 1,500 meters, thick enough to hide aircraft until they were dangerously close, but also thick enough to hide U-976 from aerial observation. Or so the theory went. Below, in the control room, Oberleutnant zur See Karl Brenner monitored the instruments with practiced efficiency. He was 26, sharp-featured, with the kind of nervous energy that made him excellent at his post and difficult to live with in confined quarters. The control room lights cast everything in shades of red to preserve night vision, turning the men's faces into masks of shadow and crimson highlights. Hydrophone contact. The operator, Maitre Senfreiter Dieter Schmidt, announced suddenly, his voice tight. Aircraft engines. Bearing 045, range indeterminate. Henke felt his stomach tighten. Every U-boat commander knew this moment, had drilled for it until the responses became muscle memory. He pressed the intercom button. Battle stations, surface action. Gun crews to their posts. Prepare for crash dive on my command. The alarm bell shattered the submarine's routine. Men erupted from their stations, abandoning meals half-eaten, letters half-written, the small comforts they'd carved from the steel monotony of patrol. The gun crews scrambled up through the conning tower hatch, their boots clanging on the ladder rungs. The 20mm and 37mm flak guns swiveled on their mounts as the crews loaded shells with hands that shook slightly despite years of training. Henke swept his binoculars across the cloud ceiling. The new doctrine, drilled into every U-boat crew over the past year, was clear. Fight on the surface if possible. Dive only as a last resort. Too many submarines had been caught during the crash dive sequence, destroyed by depth charges while they struggled beneath the waves. The fleet had learned, adapted. The flak guns could drive off most attackers. The men believed this. They had to believe it. Contact strengthening, Schmidt reported. Multiple engines. Twin-engine aircraft, possibly more than one. Brenner appeared at Henke's elbow, his face drawn. Orders, Herr Kalu? We wait, Henke said. If they're Sunderlands or Liberators, we fight. If they're carrying depth charges, we might have a chance. He didn't finish the thought. They both knew that might was doing heavy work in that sentence. The gun crews huddled behind their weapons, scanning the clouds with eyes trained to spot the dark silhouettes of enemy aircraft. Oberstfreiter Hans Weber commanded the 37mm gun, a stocky Bavarian with hands like iron vices and a reputation for steady nerves under fire. He'd shot down a Wellington bomber 3 months earlier, earning himself an Iron Cross and the respect of every man aboard. Now he squinted into the gray ceiling, his jaw working steadily on a piece of rubber, a nervous habit he'd developed to keep himself calm. There, one of the lookouts shouted, pointing starboard, breaking through the clouds. Henke swung his glasses toward the indicated bearing. For a moment, he saw nothing but gray upon gray, the clouds churning in slow motion. Then the shape emerged, and his blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Atlantic wind. 2 aircraft diving in formation, twin-engine, smaller than the usual patrol bombers. The silhouette was unmistakable to anyone who'd studied the recognition manuals. De Havilland Mosquito. Fast, maneuverable, deadly. But these weren't the bomber variants. These were fighter bombers, and they were coming in low and hard, their approach angle all wrong for a depth charge run. Mosquitoes, Henke barked into the intercom. Twin fighters attacking from starboard. All guns, prepare to fire. The Mosquitoes separated as they closed, one breaking left to circle around for a second pass, the other continuing its dive straight toward you. 976. Henke could see the aircraft clearly now, its wooden frame painted in camouflage greens and browns, the RAF roundels stark against the wings. Something protruded from the nose, something that looked wrong, too large, too purposeful. What are they carrying? Brenner asked, his voice climbing an octave. I don't see rockets. No depth charges. Henke didn't answer. His mind raced through the possibilities. Mosquitoes armed with cannon could strafe the deck, kill the gun crews, but they couldn't sink a submarine. Unless, he thought with sudden clarity, unless intelligence had been wrong. There had been rumors, dismissed as Allied propaganda, about a new weapon. A massive cannon mounted in the nose of specially modified Mosquitoes. The so-called XVIII variant, fitted with a 57mm Molins gun designed to punch through U-boat pressure holes. But the briefings had assured them it was psychological warfare, a myth meant to terrify crews into diving prematurely. Her Kalu, Weber shouted from the 37mm mount. That's not a standard gun. Look at the size of the barrel. The lead Mosquito was perhaps 800 meters out now, closing at tremendous speed. Henke could see the pilot in the cockpit, could almost imagine the man's finger tightening on the firing button. Everything seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. He opened his mouth to give the order to dive, but before the words could form, the Mosquito's nose lit up with muzzle flash. The first shell hit the water 10 meters ahead of the submarine, sending up a geyser of white spray. The second shell screamed overhead with a sound like tearing canvas. The third struck the conning tower's base with a metallic shriek that made Henke's teeth ache. The impact threw him sideways into the periscope housing, his ribs screaming protest. Around him, the gun crews were firing back, the 20mm and 37mm weapons hammering out their defiant chorus. But the Mosquito was already past, banking hard to port as its companion lined up for its own attack run. Dive! 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 Henke roared into the intercom, blood running from where his forehead had struck the periscope. Emergency dive. Clear the deck. Everyone below. The gun crews didn't need telling twice. They abandoned their weapons and threw themselves toward the conning tower hatch, a tangle of limbs and terror. Weber was last, his face pale as he realized what they were facing. Mein Gott! He whispered as he dropped through the hatch. They weren't lying. Henke followed, pulling the hatch shut and spinning the wheel with hands that suddenly felt numb. Below, the control room was organized chaos. Brenner stood at the dive controls, his hands dancing across the switches and valves. Flood ballast tanks. 10-degree down angle. Take us to 20 meters. The deck tilted sharply as the submarine began its plunge. Water roared into the ballast tanks with a sound like approaching thunder. The bow dipped, the stern rising behind them as U-976 committed to the dive that every man aboard had been trained to execute without conscious thought. 30 seconds, the manuals said. 30 seconds from the alarm to submersion, from the illusion of safety on the surface to the reality of protection beneath the waves. But 18 seconds was all they had. The second Mosquito opened fire as U-970 SIXS conning tower broke beneath the surface. Henke felt the impacts through the steel hull, felt each shell as a personal violation. The armor-piercing rounds, designed specifically for this purpose, punched through the ocean's surface with barely diminished velocity. Water provided no shield, no sanctuary. The shells that would have harmlessly splashed against a ship's armored belt instead penetrated the submarine's thin skin as if it were paper. The first round to breach the hull struck the forward torpedo room. Obermatt Friedrich Koch was securing the torpedo tubes when the world exploded around him. The shell passed through his chest before he could register pain, then continued through the tube door mechanism, rupturing the seal. Seawater fountained into the compartment under pressure, a solid column of destruction that swept Coke's body against the bulkhead like a rag doll. The two other men in the compartment, torpedo men Gruber and Lindemann, had time to scream before the water reached their waists, then their chests, then silenced them forever. In the control room, warning lights blazed red across the damage board. Forward torpedo room flooding. The damage control officer shouted, "Seal the forward bulkhead." But there was no response from the torpedo room. No acknowledgement, no sound of men fighting the water. Just the terrible hiss of the ocean claiming what it considered its due. A second shell struck farther aft, tearing through the pressure hull just forward of the engine room. This round exploded on impact with the diesel engine itself, sending shrapnel ripping through pipes and flesh alike. Machinist Oberstfreiter Anton Richter died instantly, his body shredded by steel fragments. The engine screamed, metal grinding against metal as critical components disintegrated. Oil sprayed from ruptured lines, mixing with seawater and blood to create a toxic slurry that covered every surface. "Engine room reports critical damage," Brenner called out, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Both diesels offline. We're on battery power only." Henke gripped the periscope housing, his mind racing through options that were rapidly diminishing to none. The submarine was still diving, but without propulsion, they were a falling stone rather than a controlled descent. The forward compartment was flooding. The engine room was compromised. And somewhere above them, those two mosquitoes were circling like sharks, waiting to see if their prey would resurface or slip beneath the waves forever. "Level off at 20 meters, Henke ordered. "All compartments, damage reports." The responses came in a cascading litany of disaster. The forward torpedo room was lost, sealed off with 3 men trapped inside. The engine room was taking on water slowly but steadily, the pumps barely keeping ahead of the leaks. The battery compartment reported damage to several cells, with the nauseating smell of chlorine gas beginning to permeate through the ventilation system. One of the electric motors was making grinding noises that suggested imminent failure. Schmidt, the hydrophone operator, looked up from his station with haunted eyes. "I can still hear them, Herr Kalu. They're circling overhead, waiting." Henke closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to think through the fog of shock and disbelief. Everything they'd been told, everything they'd trained for, had been built on a foundation of lies. The crash dive was supposed to be salvation, 30 seconds to safety. But the British had countered that defense with typical efficiency, creating a weapon that turned those 30 seconds into a killing ground. 18 seconds, he realized. That's all it had taken for those shells to find them. 18 seconds between the first muzzle flash and the impacts that had doomed his boat. "Can we surface?" Brenner asked quietly. It was a reasonable question. On the surface, they might surrender, might save the surviving crew. But Henke had been a U-boat commander long enough to know the mathematics of the situation. They'd been hit hard, but they weren't sinking immediately. If they surfaced now, those mosquitoes would finish the job with ruthless efficiency. Their only chance, slim as it was, lay in staying submerged and trying to limp away on battery power alone. "We stay down," Henke said. "Minimum speed. Heading 270. We make for the French coast. Perhaps we can beach her somewhere." It was a desperate plan, the kind of maneuver you attempted when all the good options had evaporated. The French coast was at least 50 kilometers away, and they'd be running on batteries the entire time. In a damaged boat leaking with injured men and diminishing air quality, it would take hours they might not have. But what was the alternative? Surface and die under the Mosquito's guns? Stay here and slowly sink as the damage overwhelmed the pumps? At least heading for the coast gave them something to do, some purpose beyond waiting for death. The crew settled into the grim routine of a damaged submarine. Damage control parties worked frantically to shore up leaking seams and patch holes too small to immediately doom them but large enough to steadily worsen their situation. The pumps ran continuously, their electric motors whining as they fought to keep ahead of the ingress. In the sealed forward torpedo room, the water continued to rise, claiming the space inch by inch. Henke moved through the boat, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement that sounded hollow even to his own ears. In the engine room, Mosquito worked waist-deep in oily water, trying to stabilize the damage. One of the diesel engines was beyond repair, its block cracked, its internals scattered across the compartment. The other might be salvageable if they could ever surface, but that was a consideration for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. In the crew quarters, the injured lay in makeshift bunks. The medical officer, Sanitätsobergefährder Ludwig Becker, moved among them with the desperate efficiency of a man trying to perform miracles with inadequate supplies. 2 men had been caught by shrapnel from the engine room explosion. One, Gefreiter Paul Newman, would probably survive if they could get him to a proper hospital. The other, Matrose Joseph Kessler, had taken fragments to his abdomen and was bleeding internally. Becker knew, and Kessler probably knew, that without surgery he had hours at most. "Do what you can," Henke told Becker quietly. "Save who you can save." Becker nodded without looking up, his hands slick with blood as he tried to compress a wound that wouldn't stop seeping. "There's not much I can do, Herr Kalu. Not down here." The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. U-976 crept westward at 2 knots, barely moving, every turn of the propeller draining their precious battery reserves. Schmidt monitored the hydrophones constantly, tracking the mosquitoes above and the other sounds of the ocean, the distant throb of ship engines, the clicks and whistles of dolphins, the groaning of their own damaged hull settling under the pressure. "They're still up there," Schmidt reported every 30 minutes, his voice growing more strained each time. "I don't think they're leaving." Of course they weren't leaving, Henke thought bitterly. Why would they? They knew they'd scored hits. They were probably calling in additional aircraft, maybe surface vessels. The Royal Navy would be converging on this position like antibodies rushing to an infection. U-976 was a wounded animal, and the hunters could smell blood in the water. Brenner appeared at Henke's side, a clipboard in his hands covered with calculations. "Betere Status, Herr Kalu. At current drain, we have perhaps 6 more hours. After that, we'll have barely enough power to maintain life support, let alone propulsion." 6 hours. Henke did the mental arithmetic. At 2 knots, that would carry them perhaps 12 kilometers closer to the coast. Still more than 38 kilometers from safety, if safety was even a word that applied anymore. They could shut down non-essential systems, stretch the batteries a bit further, but that would only delay the inevitable. "What's the air quality?" Henke asked. Brenner consulted his clipboard. "Carbon dioxide levels rising. Nothing critical yet, but with the scrubbers damaged and 78 men breathing in a sealed tube, we're looking at perhaps 12 hours before it becomes dangerous." 78 men. They'd left port with 81. 3 confirmed dead in the forward torpedo room, and Kessler would make it 4 soon enough. Every man aboard knew the statistics, knew that U-boat crews had the highest casualty rate of any service in the German military. More than 70% of U-boat men who went to sea never came home. They'd accepted that reality when they pinned on their uniforms, but acceptance didn't make it any easier when the moment arrived. A shudder ran through the submarine, a groaning of stressed metal that made every man freeze. For a heartbeat, Henke thought they were breaking up, that the pressure hull had finally surrendered to the accumulated damage. But the groaning subsided, leaving only the steady drip of water and the whine of the pumps. "Herr Kalu," Weber called from the engine room hatch. "We've got a problem. The main bilge pump just seized. We're on the auxiliary now, but it's not keeping up. Water levels rising." Of course it was, because that's how disasters cascaded, one failure breeding another, each problem compounding until the entire system collapsed. Henke forced himself to remain calm, to think through the implications. Without adequate pumping capacity, the water would continue to accumulate. Eventually, it would reach critical equipment, short out electrical systems, contaminate the batteries. Even if they could stretch their power reserves another few hours, the flooding would doom them long before then. "Can we repair the main pump?" Henke asked. Weber shook his head. "The motor's burned out. We'd need parts we don't have, tools we can't use underwater, and time we're running out of." The truth was crystallizing now, taking shape like ice forming on a winter window. They weren't going to make it to the coast. They weren't going to beach the submarine and save the crew. U-976 was dying, and every minute they stayed submerged brought them closer to becoming a tomb rather than a vessel. Henke looked around the control room at the faces of his officers and crew. Young faces, mostly boys who'd been pulled from schools and farms and factories to fight a war that had long since lost any pretense of glory. They looked back at him with expressions that ranged from resignation to barely controlled panic. They were waiting for him to save them, to pull off the miracle that U-boat commanders were supposed to perform when everything went wrong. But there were no miracles left, just hard choices and desperate gambles. "Prepare to surface," Henke said quietly. The control room went silent except for the ever-present sounds of machinery and leaking water. Brenner stared at him. "Her Kalu, the mosquitoes, are probably still up there," Henke finished. "I know, but we're sinking, Carl. Slowly but inevitably. If we stay down, we all die. If we surface, maybe they'll let us surrender. Maybe they'll strafe us and we die quickly instead of slowly suffocating. But at least some of us might survive." It was capitulation, the admission of defeat, and it tasted like ashes in Henke's mouth. But what else could he do? Continue this farce until the lights went out and the air turned toxic and 78 men died in the darkness? "Sound stations for surfacing," Henke ordered. "All hands prepare to abandon ship on my command. Break out the life vests. Destroy all sensitive documents." The crew moved with the leaden efficiency of men who'd run out of hope. The encryption machines were smashed. The code books fed into the furnace in the galley. Charts marked with patrol routes torn into confetti. Life vests were distributed, though everyone knew that the cold March water of the Bay of Biscay could kill in minutes even if the mosquitoes didn't. "Ready to surface, Her Kalu," Brenner reported. Henke took a deep breath, tasting the foul air that had sustained them through this nightmare. "Blow ballast tanks. Take us up. Emergency speed." The submarine lurched as compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing out the water that had pulled them beneath the waves. U-970's bow angled upward sharply, climbing toward the surface, toward the light, toward whatever fate awaited them in the world above. They broke through with a violence that spoke to their desperation, the conning tower erupting from the water in a shower of spray. Henke threw open the hatch and emerged onto the bridge, his lungs gasping at the cold, clean air. The gray sky stretched overhead, the clouds lower now, threatening rain. The sea rolled around them in endless swells. And there, circling at perhaps 500 meters altitude, were the two mosquitoes. Henke raised his hands slowly, making the universal gesture of surrender. Around him, crew members poured from the hatches, some clutching life vests, others already stripping off their boots in preparation for the swim they knew was coming. The submarine wallowed in the waves, her stern noticeably lower than her bow, water streaming from the damage holes in her hull. One of the mosquitoes descended, making a low pass over the submarine. Henke could see the pilot clearly, could see the massive cannon barrel protruding from the aircraft's nose. The Molins gun, he thought with bitter clarity. Not propaganda, not a myth. A very real weapon that had just revolutionized anti-submarine warfare and rendered obsolete the defensive doctrine that thousands of U-boat men had trusted with their lives. The mosquito waggled its wings, a gesture Henke interpreted as acknowledgement. The pilot had seen the surrender, had communicated it to someone. Now they waited. A half-hour later, a British destroyer appeared on the horizon, her bow wave-white against the gray sea. She approached cautiously, her guns trained on the wallowing U-boat, clearly expecting a trap. But U-976 had no more fight left in her. The crew lined the deck, hands visible, as the destroyer closed to within 50 meters. "Abandon ship," Henke ordered. "Everyone into the water. Stay together. Help the injured." The crew began jumping, some diving cleanly, others tumbling awkwardly into the cold Atlantic. The destroyer launched boats, her crew moving with professional efficiency to pull German sailors from the water. Henke waited until last, as tradition demanded, standing on the conning tower as his submarine settled deeper into the waves. U-976 went down slowly, her bow rising as the stern filled completely. The last thing visible was the conning tower, the scarred metal bearing witness to the 18 seconds that had doomed her. Then she slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple, carrying with her the bodies of Koch, Gruber, and Lindemann in her flooded forward compartment, and taking with her the illusions that had sustained the U-boat force through years of bitter warfare. Henke treaded water, watching the spot where his command had disappeared. Strong hands grabbed him, hauled him toward one of the rescue boats. He didn't resist. There was nothing left to resist with. On the destroyer's deck, wrapped in blankets, Henke watched as his crew was processed by British sailors who treated them with distant professionalism. 74 survivors. 7 men lost. The mathematics of it seemed inadequate to capture what had happened, but mathematics was all they had. A British officer approached, a lieutenant commander with salt-grade temples and the weathered look of a career naval man. "I'm Lieutenant Commander James Wickham," he said in serviceable German. "You're aboard HMS Starling. You and your men are prisoners of war." Henke nodded.
Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, U-976.
"The Mosquitoes reported you'd been hit," Wickham said. "They weren't sure you'd survive the dive." "We barely did," Henke said. "That gun of yours, the cannon they're carrying. We were told it was propaganda, an Allied trick to frighten us." Wickham's expression didn't change. "The 57mm Molins. We call the aircraft carrying them XVIII. They've been operational for about 3 months now. You're not the first U-boat they've engaged, but you might be the first crew to survive an encounter." Henke felt something cold settle in his chest. 3 months. The weapon had been operational for 3 months, and U-boat command had dismissed it as fantasy. How many submarines had gone down believing they were safe once they reached diving depth? How many men had died in those critical seconds between the alarm and submersion, killed by a threat they'd been assured didn't exist? "Your superiors will want to know about this," Wickham continued. "About the XVIII. About what happened today." "They won't learn from us," Henke said automatically, the reflex of a military man remembering his duty not to provide intelligence to the enemy. "They don't need to," Wickham said, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "Word will spread. Your survivors will be taken to POW camps. They'll talk to other prisoners. Stories like this, they spread like wildfire through the prisoner networks. Within weeks, every U-boat man in captivity will know about what happened to U-976. And eventually, that information will make its way back to Germany." He was right, of course. The intelligence services could keep secrets, but they couldn't stop men from talking to each other, couldn't prevent the stories from filtering through the complex networks of communication that existed even in imprisonment. And once the story spread, once U-boat crews learned that the crash dive was no longer the guaranteed salvation it had once been, everything would change. Henke watched the Mosquitoes circling overhead, their elegant wooden frames carrying death in a form he'd never imagined. 18 seconds. That's all it had taken to shatter the faith that had sustained the U-boat force. 18 seconds between the illusion of safety and the reality of obsolescence. In the days that followed, as HMS Starling transported her prisoners to port, Henke learned more about what had happened. The Molins gun was an automatic weapon, capable of firing 25 rounds in 15 seconds. Each shell was armor-piercing, designed specifically to penetrate U-boat hulls even through water. The XVIII Mosquitoes hunted in pairs, coordinating their attacks to catch submarines during the vulnerable dive sequence. It was systematic, efficient, and absolutely devastating. The British, Henke realized, had studied their enemy with careful attention and then engineered a solution that exploited every weakness in U-boat tactics. The crash dive doctrine had been developed when aircraft carried bombs or depth charges, weapons that required direct hits or close proximity. But the Molins gun changed everything. It didn't need to be directly overhead. It could fire from hundreds of meters away, its shells punching through the ocean's surface to reach the submarine beneath. When they reached port, Henke and his crew were processed through the machinery of prisoner reception. They were photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated by intelligence officers who wanted to know about U-970 SIXS patrol, about her capabilities, about what Henke had seen and done. He gave them nothing beyond name, rank, and serial number. maintaining the professional courtesy of one naval officer to another even in captivity. But among his fellow prisoners, Germans who'd been captured weeks or months earlier, Henke found himself unable to remain silent. They asked about his capture and he told them about the Mosquitoes with their massive nose-mounted cannon, about the 18 seconds of terror as shells ripped through water and steel, about watching his submarine sink with men still trapped inside. The story spread exactly as Wickham had predicted. Within days, other prisoners were repeating it, embellishing it, turning it into the kind of cautionary tale that submariners told to make sense of their fears. The XVIII became a bogeyman, a monster that could reach them even in the depths. The crash dive, once the first and best defense of any U-boat, became a desperate gamble rather than a reliable tactic. Somewhere in Germany, in the headquarters where U-boat operations were planned and executed, intelligence officers compiled reports from returning patrols. They noted the increased losses in the Bay of Biscay. They analyzed the tactical situation and gradually came to understand what Henke had learned in 18 Seconds of Violence: that the war beneath the waves had entered a new and final phase. The U-boats were losing. They'd been losing for a while, really ever since the Allies had cracked the Enigma codes and learned to track submarine positions with increasing accuracy. But weapons like the XVIII accelerated the defeat, transformed it from a gradual attrition into a rout. U-boats that had once prowled the Atlantic with impunity now huddled in port, their crews reluctant to face the gauntlet of aircraft and escort vessels that made every patrol a suicide mission. Henke never learned the full extent of how his story influenced the final year of the U-boat war. He spent the remainder of the conflict in various POW camps, moving through the system as the Allies consolidated their prisoners in preparation for eventual repatriation. He met other U-boat commanders, heard their stories of narrow escapes and catastrophic losses. Almost all of them knew about U-976 and the Mosquitoes with their terrible gun. Some told him he was lucky to have survived. Others said it would have been better to go down with his boat. In quiet moments, Henke thought about those 18 seconds, about how quickly everything had changed, how completely the assumptions that had kept him alive through 5 years of war had been revealed as fatal illusions. He thought about Koch and Gruber and Lindemann drowned in the forward torpedo room, about Kessler, who'd died of his injuries before they could surrender, about all the other U-boat men who'd gone down believing that reaching diving depth meant safety. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered. The U-boat force ceased to exist. Henke and thousands like him were gradually processed through the repatriation system and sent home to a country that had been bombed into rubble, where hungry children begged in the streets and the future was an uncertain thing. Henke returned to Bremen and found his family's house damaged but standing. His wife had survived, as had his 2 daughters. They welcomed him home with tears and relief, and he tried to readjust to a life without the constant vibration of diesel engines, without the smell of unwashed bodies in confined spaces, without the fear that every sound might be depth charges or aircraft engines. He never talked about the war much. When pressed, he'd offer vague generalities about patrols and convoys, but he kept the specifics locked away. Some memories were too heavy to share, some experiences too terrible to inflict on others. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd wake with the sound of shells hitting water echoing through his mind, and he'd lie awake counting 1, 2, 3, for all the way to 18, marking the seconds that had changed everything. The survivors of U-976 scattered across Germany and beyond, carrying their shared experience into the decades that followed. Some became fishermen, returning to the sea that had nearly claimed them. Others sought landlocked lives, never wanting to see the ocean again. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews, adding their voices to the historical record of the U-boat war. But all of them, for the rest of their lives, would remember March 25, 1944. They would remember the 2 Mosquitoes diving from the clouds. They would remember the crash dive that was supposed to save them. And they would remember discovering, in the span of 18 seconds, that everything they'd believed about survival was a lie. The XVIII Mosquitoes continued hunting U-boats through the final year of the war, claiming more victims, spreading more terror through the submarine force. But U-970's story remained singular, not because it was the only submarine attacked by these aircraft, but because it was one of the few where enough crew survived to tell what had happened, to bear witness to the moment when an entire doctrine collapsed under the weight of technological reality. In the histories written after the war, U-976 merited only a footnote. One more submarine lost among hundreds. One more crew scattered among thousands. The strategic significance of her sinking was minimal. Germany was already losing the Battle of the Atlantic by March of 1944, and one more U-boat made little difference to the final outcome. But for the men who'd been there, who'd felt the shells tear through their hull, who'd watched their submarine sink beneath the waves, it had been everything. It had been the moment when the illusions fell away and they saw their situation with terrible clarity. It had been 18 seconds that contained entire lifetimes of fear and understanding and bitter recognition of how completely the world had changed while they'd been living in the steel confines of their submarine. Werner Henke lived another 23 years after the war, working as a shipping clerk in Bremen. A quiet life that suited a man who'd had enough excitement for several lifetimes. He died in 1968, his daughters at his bedside, his grandchildren playing in the next room. Among his effects, they found a battered photograph of U-976, taken before the war, when she was new and the future seemed bright with possibility. On the back, in Henke's careful handwriting, was a single line, 18 seconds. That's all it took. His daughters never understood what it meant, never connected it to the father they'd known as a quiet, methodical man who sometimes stared at the horizon with an expression they couldn't interpret. They kept the photograph anyway, filed it away with the other mementos of a life lived through terrible times. Somewhere at the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, the wreck of U-976 rests in the darkness, her pressure hull ruptured, her compartments filled with silt and the slow accumulation of marine growth. The 3 men entombed in her forward torpedo room became part of her forever, their bones resting among the rusted machinery that had once been their workplace and ultimately became their grave. Occasionally, fishing nets snag on her conning tower, and confused trawler crews haul up fragments of corroded metal, never knowing what vessel they've disturbed or what story lies beneath the waves. The legacy of that March day in 1944 extended far beyond the individual tragedy of U-976. The psychological impact on the U-boat force was immeasurable. A creeping dread that transformed the crash dive from a reflexive survival instinct into a calculated risk. Commanders hesitated in those critical seconds, weighing the known danger above against the newly revealed threat that could reach them even as they descended. That hesitation cost lives, cost boats, cost the last vestiges of offensive capability the U-boat fleet possessed. The submariners who survived the war and eventually returned to civilian life carried that knowledge with them into the Reconstruction years. They became teachers, engineers, merchants, fathers, grandfathers, their wartime experiences gradually fading into the past. But certain memories never truly faded. The sound of the alarm, the tilt of the deck as the dive began, the awful realization that the water offered no protection. These stayed sharp and clear, even as other details blurred with time. In the Naval Archives of Great Britain, a detailed after-action report filed by Lieutenant Commander Wickham sits among thousands of similar documents, a bureaucratic accounting of an encounter that was, from the British perspective, entirely routine. The XVIII Mosquitoes had performed exactly as designed. The U-boat had been engaged, damaged, and forced to surface. Prisoners had been taken, intelligence gathered, one more enemy submarine removed from the board. Success, measured and filed and forgotten among the countless other successes of a war that ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. But numbers on a page never captured the full reality of what happened when metal met flesh, when doctrine met innovation, when the certainty of survival met the finality of death. The report said U-976 was damaged and scuttled. They didn't mention the terror in Schmidt's voice as he reported the engine sounds growing louder. They didn't record Weber's whispered prayer as he abandoned his gun. They didn't preserve the look on Brenner's face as he realized they were truly beaten. History remembers the great battles, the turning points, the moments when entire armies clashed and the fate of nations hung in the balance. The sinking of U-976 was none of these things. It was a small engagement, tactically insignificant, strategically irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Yet for 74 men who climbed from the cold Atlantic onto the deck of HMS Starling, it was the single most significant event of their lives, the hinge upon which everything else turned. Years later, when the Cold War brought renewed interest in submarine warfare and military historians began examining the tactics of the Battle of the Atlantic, some researchers stumbled across references to the XVIII Mosquito program. They noted with academic interest how the British had identified a vulnerability in German defensive doctrine and engineered a weapon to exploit it. Papers were written. Conferences were held. The development of the Molins gun was praised as an example of innovative military thinking. But lost in the analysis, buried beneath the strategic assessments and technical specifications, was the human cost of that innovation. The men who died testing whether the new doctrine would work. The crews who went down believing they were following the correct procedures, never knowing that those procedures had been rendered obsolete by changes in technology they hadn't been informed about. The families who received telegrams saying their sons or husbands or fathers were missing, presumed lost at sea, with no details about how or why or what their final moments had been like. U-970 SIX's story became one of thousands, a single thread in the vast tapestry of the war at sea. But for those who'd lived it, who'd counted those 18 seconds as the longest of their lives, it remained singular, unique, impossible to compare to anything else. They'd been present at the moment when everything changed, when the old certainties died and the new realities were born in violence and terror and the freezing water of the Atlantic. The submarine war continued for another 13 months after U-976 went down, growing progressively more desperate and hopeless for the Germans. The kill ratio shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. For every merchant ship sunk, multiple U-boats were destroyed. The ports filled with submarines whose crews refused to sail, knowing they'd be going to their deaths. The experienced commanders were gone, killed or captured, replaced by boys barely out of training who had enthusiasm but no skill, courage but no wisdom. And through it all, the story of the XVIII Mosquito spread. It became larger than life in the retelling, the way all cautionary tales do. The gun grew bigger in memory, the shells more numerous, the destruction more complete. But at the core, the essential truth remained unchanged. The ocean was no longer safe, the crash dive no longer reliable, and the men who went to sea in U-boats were sailing not toward glory or victory but toward almost certain death. When peace finally came in May of 1945, the surviving U-boats were ordered to surface, to fly black flags of surrender, to sail to designated ports and hand themselves over to Allied control. The men who'd spent years hunting in the depths came up into the light and discovered a world that had moved on without them, that had no place for their particular skills, that viewed them with suspicion or pity or outright hostility. The Naval Archives preserve one final document related to U-976, a letter written by Henke from the POW camp to his wife in August of 1944. It had been censored, naturally, with entire paragraphs blacked out by British intelligence officers. But one passage survived the censor's pen, perhaps because it seemed innocuous, perhaps because the officer reading it understood something about the need for a man to unburden himself. "I think often of those seconds," Henke wrote, his handwriting careful on the thin paper provided to prisoners. "How quickly everything can change. How the things we believe to keep us safe can fail. I count them still sometimes when I cannot sleep. 18 seconds. It seems like such a small amount of time, but it contained everything." His wife kept the letter until her own death decades later, though she never fully understood what her husband had been trying to express. How could she? She hadn't been there. She hadn't felt the deck tilt beneath her feet as the submarine began its final dive. She hadn't heard the shells punching through steel and water. She hadn't experienced the terrible clarity that comes when illusions shatter and reality reveals itself in all its harsh, unforgiving truth. The men of U-976 scattered across the years and across the world, their paths diverging as they rebuilt their lives from the wreckage of war. Some prospered, finding success in business or academia or the slowly rebuilding German military. Others struggled, haunted by memories they couldn't escape, drinking too much, working jobs beneath their capabilities, never quite able to reintegrate into civilian life. A few took their own lives, finding the weight of survival heavier than the weight of death. But whether they succeeded or failed in the post-war world, whether they found peace or remained forever at war with their memories, they all carried with them the knowledge of what those 18 seconds had taught them. That safety is an illusion. That doctrine is only as good as the technology that supports it. that the margin between life and death can be measured in fractions of time, so small they barely register on human perception yet contain within them entire universes of consequence.